Hi, everyone. We're going to begin this latest session, Fading of Black Political Unity. We've got a really great crew of folks here. We're going to go for around 45 minutes, and then, of course, take questions from the audience with a relative limit of comment to question ratio, hopefully being adhered to. So just to get a go, left to right, I'm joined by Jason Riley of the Manhattan Institute and the Wall Street Journal, joined by Charles Blaine, coming here from Houston, focusing on urban reform issues, and of course, Rui Teixeira of the American Enterprise Institute and Liberal Patriot. I would like to just begin by getting each panelist, including myself, to kind of offer some context for how we're approaching this topic. So I work at the University of Texas at Austin, and I also host a podcast called The Realignment. So I'm personally very interested in how, during the Trump plus era, we're seeing new coalitions and new identities matter in ways that didn't before 2015. So Jason, I'd love for you to kind of kick things off just by contextualizing yourself and just introducing how you're thinking of this question of the status of Black political unity.
Sure. So I've been writing for the Wall Street Journal since the mid-1990s and following these issues from the perspective of an opinion journalist. So dating back to the Clinton administration, and watching the voting patterns shift, both in terms of turnout and in terms of loyalty to one party based on race or ethnicity or other factors. And so that's what I'm sort of bringing to the table, just as a journalist who's covered these things over the years. So.
How about you, Charles?
Yeah. So I run an organization called Urban Reform Institute, and we focus mainly on the municipal level. And so we look at large urban cities. I'm in Houston, so that's kind of my primary focus and probably what I'll reference a lot today. But we look at just look at large cities across the country. And so that's the way I look at it, is kind of from a nonpartisan perspective, but how folks are voting for Democrats or Republicans in nonpartisan elections and the issues that they are leaning towards or against.
Yeah, I tend to focus on political demographics and the evolution of political coalitions. I've studied this issue and the data pertaining thereof for many, many, many years. And lately I've become really obsessed with the evolution of the non-white vote, because it's so significant and so clearly important in terms of recent trends in American politics. And I wrote a book just recently with John Judas, because where have all the Democrats gone? And a significant part of that is we examine what's happened with the non-white vote over time, particularly the non-white working class vote. It's most noticeable in terms of Hispanics, but this is subject of the panel here today, we're now seeing some of these fissures occur in the black vote, which is very interesting, and I'm fascinated to sort of keep track of it and try to understand it.
I'll actually kick things off with you then. What is actually happening when it comes to this question of Black political unity? There's a lot of big narratives, lots of op-eds have been birthed from this topic area, and there are all sorts of polls we could cite, but obviously there's a gap between the polling and the actual outcomes of these issues. How would you actually assess the state of Black political unity today?
Well, I mean, if you compare it to the Obama election of 2012, there's been a very significant shift, not as big as with Hispanics since that time. Right, among the black vote, there's been a fairly steady decline in support for Democrats and for Democratic presidential candidates, and even in the House vote in 2022, there was another significant shift relative to 2020 among black voters. So we're seeing a diminution of the almost monolithic support of black voters for the Democrats. And if you look at the polling today, I mean, this is really what's freaking people out in Democratic circles. I mean, you've got this massive shift toward Trump among black voters, if you're to believe the polls. Sort of on average, it looks like the Democratic margin among black voters has declined by 25 points in these polls relative to 2020. And that's, I doubt if we'll see that big a shift, but clearly something's going on. And it seems to be concentrated among black men, among younger black voters, and among black working class voters. Those are the three demographics that seem to be important here. But, there's shifts all over the black vote, but it's concentrated in those areas. So we just don't know, obviously, how that's really going to turn out in this election. But, there's a signal there. There's some noise, too, but there's a big signal, and it's an important signal.
And I'd be curious, Charles, to what degree are you witnessing this in the urban context which is obviously going to be a little less partisan. The issue set is going to be kind of different than the bigger one we're going to see in national op-ed pages. How are you seeing this dynamic, especially with the working class young men like black voters?
Yeah, well, I think it's a similar trend, especially because you're seeing a lot of nationalization of these local issues and trying to kind of elevate them to that point. And so, I mean, just kind of use an anecdote. We had a recent election in the city of Houston for municipal election for mayor and city council, and it's a nonpartisan election, but we had two kind of long-term institutional Democrats. Both had been in office for 40 plus years. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who represents a predominantly black urban district, and State Senator John Whitmire, who's been in office, was in the Senate for about 40 years, and represented a lot of inner city Houston as well, and much more of a conservative Democrat than Sheila Jackson Lee. And so throughout the course of that campaign, she ran very heavily targeted ads framing him as a Republican and trying to get black voters geared up to vote against him. And a lot of the polling throughout the course of that election said that 2/3 of black voters were going to go for her, which would keep the race tight because you had large percentage of black voters going for her. You had kind of business Republicans going for him, and then kind of a smattering of Hispanics in the city to split among the two. And when it actually came to it, black voters showed up 20% less than they did 8 years ago. And so they did not show up for her. And then when you broke it down to the precinct level, she lost nearly all of the precincts in her own congressional district. And while this was a nonpartisan election between a conservative Democrat and a more liberal Democrat, the way that broke out when you looked down ballot is we had city council members who represent, we have 11 districts and 5 at large. The 11 districts represent about 250,000 people each. The at large represent the whole city, 2.3 million. And we had, the first black Republican, I think they're saying since Reconstruction, elected citywide. We had Hispanic former Republican, former prosecutor elected citywide, and that carried some of them through. So while at the top of the ticket, we did have 2 Democrats, you saw the Republican gains at the lower level. And then you just saw that in some of the commentary as well. I mean, school choice is a big issue in Texas right now. Black voters are overwhelmingly in favor of it. So you're seeing it in these kind of non-directly partisan contexts, but it's still showing up.
Jason, I'm curious. Every single thing that Roy and Charles have said is basically the dreams of a variety of funders and founders of organizations going back to the 1990s in terms of the black vote truly being at the margins, up for grabs. What would you say has happened over the course of the past 30 years to make this possible in a way that seems decently organic relative to a lot of the institutional efforts that have been made?
I think part of this has to do with the sort of disillusionment of many blacks coming out of the Obama years. And what I mean by that is in the post-60s era, particularly since the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the civil rights leaders, the black leadership, the activists have been laser focused on increasing black political clout and saying that is the avenue to black upward mobility economically, if we can just get more of our own in office. And that strategy in terms of electing blacks was pretty successful on their own terms. Throughout the 70s and 80s and 90s, you saw a lot of black elected officials in this country. Marion Barry's Washington, D.C. in the 80s, or Sharp James's Newark, New Jersey in the 90s, or Coleman Young's Detroit in the 1970s. Black police chiefs, black school superintendents. Blacks were doing quite well in terms of electing their own to office. The Obama presidency was the culmination of this strategy. But if you look at how blacks fared economically under Obama, they did not do very well. In fact, the unemployment rate for white Americans under Obama never reached double digits. It never fell below double digits for blacks until the 7th year of his presidency. In fact, the 3rd month of the 7th year. I think a lot of black Americans were shocked by how they were doing with the black man in the White House. And coming away from that experience, I think they left a lot of them sort of disillusioned in terms of how important that is, and what the downstream effects of that will be. Hitching our wagon to one party, putting all of our eggs in this basket, it doesn't seem to be working very well. And so I think that has given some blacks at the margins, at least, a reason to check out the other party. And it makes economic sense. If you look at how blacks did during the first 3 years of the Trump administration prior to COVID, very sharp contrast. Lowest black unemployment on record, lowest poverty rates on record. You had black wages rising at a faster rate than white wages. And what was going on under Trump was really a working class boom. The workers their wages were rising at faster rates than their bosses, than the management class. And it just so happens that blacks, and to a large extent Hispanics, are overrepresented in the working class. So it played out that way. But that's what we saw, and that's in the memory of a lot of black people today. It doesn't seem to matter if there's a black man in the White House as much as it matters whether the economy is growing and I can find a job and get a regular raise and not have to deal with inflation and those sorts of things. They look back on that period fondly, and probably more fondly than they look back on the Obama years for all the symbolism his presidency represented. As I like to say, symbolism doesn't pay the mortgage, it doesn't pay the rent, and I think that's part of what's going on here.
Glad you phrased it that way, because there's a follow-up question that I'll direct to the entire group here. Your articulation of the end state of the Obama presidency not reflecting well in the lives of actual black working class voters, there's kind of a contradiction here in the sense that could all be true, but I would wager that if we didn't have an amendment against a third term for a president, those same black voters would have no doubt voted for Obama in similar rates in 2016 as it did versus Mitt Romney in 2012. So the real question here, and we'll give you a quick break, we'll start with Roy again, is to what degree is this about personalities and politicians versus ideas, coalitions, and parties? It's not a shocker that Donald Trump would perform better with black voters than Mitt Romney. So to what degree is this really about those individual personas rather than the broader coalitions?
Yeah, well, the personalities of the individual candidates, presidents, whatever, I mean, this is kind of part of the noise, so we try to see if we can extract that signal about how black voters may or may not be moving toward the Republicans. And I'm convinced that even controlling for these things, these presidents, these personality characteristics, there's really a there in terms of, blacks basically, the hold of Democrats on the black voter declining. You can see that the party identification of blacks has gone down very significantly in the last 5 years, as low as it's been measured for a long time by Gallup. You see the sort of the voting behavior that I talked about, even in the congressional election of 2022. We see it in the polls currently now. So I think a lot of it is about, it's not just the economics that Jason's talking about. I do think it's, it has something to do with people comparing their, how they fared, for example, under the first 3 years of the Trump administration before COVID hit and how they've done under Biden, because basically, over the course of the administration, his administration wages haven't really kept up with inflation. They are now, but I mean, the net is negative. And the cost of living thing hits working class people, black working class voters, extremely hard. But I think, we should also talk about culture. I mean, the Democratic Party has not stayed still in terms of its views on various cultural issues around race, gender, crime, immigration, you name it. I mean, it is significantly more left party on all those issues than it was 10 years ago. And I think one question political scientists have always asked about black voters is, we know most of them aren't liberal. We know if we look at their self-identification, there's a huge chunk of them that are conservative. Why are they almost uniformly voting for the Democrats anyway? And people have looked at the content of that conservatism for black voters who say they're conservative, and they really are conservative, so, in terms of their underlying values and views. So why are they voting for the Democrats? And that, I think, is starting to change, and part of it has to do with, the increasing cultural discomfort of significant sectors of black voters, particularly those who are conservative leaning, with the currently existing Democratic Party. They're being asked to sign on to a lot of things that they're just very uncomfortable with. And, and to some extent, It's like if Democrats are so concerned with these issues and these sort of boutique positions on cultural issues, how much do they really care about my everyday life? There's a trade-off there, I think, in the minds of a lot of voters. They think there are opportunity costs for a party to focus on these issues that are mostly of concern to the most liberal elements of their base, and particularly the white college-educated base. So I think there's various forces here now that are pushing these voters who are already inclined in some ways toward the Republican Party in terms of some of their underlying positions on things and priorities, to now they're kind of being nudged out of the orbit of the Democratic Party as a totally default position for these voters. So I think, to me, that's what's going on, and it can be abstracted from the personalities and particularities of some of these candidates.
How do you think about that, Charles?
I mean, I agree. I think personality counts for a lot, especially when all things are equal or close to equal. But when you start to separate the two and people are actually comparing it to kind of what have you done for me lately, or how my life has improved under that leadership, whether it's Democratic leadership or a specific person, then personality starts to count for a bit less. And I mean, even just kind of referencing back to the election I just mentioned, one of the big questions throughout that election was, excuse me, with the congresswoman who had been in there for 30, 40 years, was how have the lives of the people in that district been made better since she's been there? And that question was constantly asked, and people couldn't really say that they have improved. And so with as high as her name ID was, with how popular she was, I mean, incredibly popular as compared to her opponent, when it came down to looking at the lives of the people in Congressional District 18 and kind of expanding that as to, if she were elected, how the lives of the people in the city of Houston would be, it didn't sell well. The personality didn't go as far as it would have otherwise if all things were considered equal. So I do think personality counts for some when you're kind of excluding some of these other factors, but I think in the end of the day, people are looking at how their lives have improved or been made worse. And personality could go either way, right? People do love to vote against people as much as they like to vote for someone. So I think that could go either way as well.
Yeah, we'll see whether we're looking at some significant realignment here or whether this is a Trump phenomenon. I think a lot of folks in the Trump camp think this is something that has to do more with Trump than maybe it does. In other words, Trump in 2016, and particularly in 2020, but even in 2016, performed slightly better than Romney had in 2012 or than McCain had in 2008, but Trump didn't have to run against Obama. Mm-hmm. So that explained
math.
a lot of what was going on. 2020 was more significant, however, and the journalist who's done some work on this that I've read recently is Ron Brownstein in The Atlantic magazine, where he's described how for decades we've known that if you knew, among white voters, if you knew the gender and educational attainment level of the white voter, those are very strong predictors of how the person would vote. And so you could divide them up into, white women with a college degree, white women without one, white men with a college degree, white men without them. And your strongest Democratic group was white women with a college degree, and your strongest Republican group were white men without a college degree. You could not traditionally break down the black vote that way. But you're starting to be able to do that if this polling is correct. And what black men without a college degree are suddenly doing is voting a lot more like their white counterparts, or they're starting to shift in that direction according to the polling. And that's what we're seeing here. I think that's progress. So the black working class males might be the harbinger of something to come here. If they're the first ones to start giving a serious look at the other party, how long will it be before others start to do the same? I don't know, but that's what we'll have to wait and see what happens in 2024 and beyond. And getting back to the personality, as Rui was saying earlier, the affinity of blacks to the Democratic Party has never been particularly ideological. And And there have been some studies done on this. Ishmael White, Cheryl Laird, in a book called Steadfast Democrats, wrote about, their finding was that blacks voted Democrat in overwhelming numbers due mostly to peer pressure. Voting Democrat was the black thing to do. If you're black, that's how you vote. Just like if you're black, this is the kind of food you eat or the kind of music you listen to. That's what you do if you're black. And to the extent there's less peer pressure to do that, you could see more blacks giving a look at to the Republican Party. And that may be happening as well. And even among these, and this gets back to something Brownstein found, even among those black working class men who are looking at the Republican Party in larger numbers, they do not really look a lot like your typical MAGA white voter. They're not, I mean literally they don't look like them, obviously. But
shocking.
They're not enamored of Donald Trump particularly. There's no real ideological alignment there. They're pretty much just disillusioned with the state of the economy right now. And that's enough for them to give a look to the Republican Party.
I can just make a quick point about about black working class men. I think, part of that, what you're seeing as them being a bellwether, is you're seeing this kind of vitriol from the left now saying that, black men are selling you out. I'm hearing this on the local level. You're hearing it even on the national level, kind of signaling to black women, black educated women, that you need to kind of get them in line because they're the ones who are kind of falling out of lockstep with what they need to be doing. And so I think they're seeing it as a bellwether as well, and they're starting to...
Just to put some numbers on that, the Wall Street Journal had a poll out, maybe it's in today's paper or yesterday's, but, and it's not a perfect apples to apples, but what they did is they looked at swing state voters today, 6 or 7 swing states. They polled blacks in those, and they compared the numbers to the data on black voters nationally in 2020. And so among black men, it's gone from 12% nationally in 2020 to 30% in the swing states today of blacks taking a look at the Republican Party, telling pollsters they will. Among women, it's almost doubled. It's gone from 6% in 2020 to 11% today. So it's not just the men, but so something could be going on. And again, we won't know until Trump leaves the political scene, I think, whether this is a uniquely Trump phenomenon or if something more substantive is going on.
Roy, something I'd love to get your thoughts on. In the framing of this panel, it made reference to working class, black, young men. And then we could also add in like a class or educational identity to that kind of set of identity layers. Of those 4 to 5, which do you think tends to be the most important when it comes to really assessing and understanding the coalitions today?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the gender thing really does, jump out because of some of the data that Jason was mentioning. It's quite striking, but I actually would. I think it's very interesting to focus on the class dimension of this, because I do think we're starting to see a divergence between the working class and college-educated parts of the black population. And that's very consistent with, sort of, again, Jason was mentioning this, the ways in which non-white working class voters, including black working class voters, are starting to vote a little bit more like their white counterparts. And that's a general tendency we've seen across non-white voters in the last, 12 years or so. If you look at the 2012 Obama election, he carried non-white working class voters as a whole by 67 points. You look at Biden in 2020, and popular vote margin was about the same for the Democrats in both elections. He carried them by 48 points. If you look at the latest New York Times poll, Biden is carrying those voters over Trump by 6 points. 6 points. I mean, so I doubt if we'll see quite that in the 2024 election, but something's going on here where these working class voters who are non-white, who are expected to be completely divorced in their political behavior from their white counterparts, are now starting to sort of move in the same direction, right? They're not voting exactly like them, of course. There's going to be a big gap still between white and non-white working class voters, but there's a sense in which I think that a lot of working class voters share that the Democratic Party is maybe less their party than it used to be. It's culturally alien. It hasn't really produced for them economically in the way they're happy with, and they're willing. And I think that class dimension is really pushing them toward giving the other party a closer look. And I think that's something I'm really keeping an eye on. And I'll be interested to see how this election turns out because, broadly speaking, we're now living the upside down. The Democrats are the party of the college educated, and the Republican Party is increasingly the party of working class voters writ large. If you look at a lot of polls, for example, for this election, you might have the Democrats behind among working class voters as a whole by 15 points, and you might have them ahead among college educated voters by 20 points. So there's something really going on here in terms of the class dimension of American politics and how that's evolving and sort of moving through the non-white population, including black voters, that I think is quite significant.
So Charles, something I'm curious about, obviously someone who focuses on urban issues, I'd love for you to talk about the urban policy aspect of this issue, because I think for a long time, school choice was kind of used as the potential wedge issue for black voters unsatisfied with the Democratic Party post-60s civil rights status quo. I clearly don't think, regardless of your views of school choice, I don't think school choice opinions are driving this transformation. So what urban policy issues other than school choice, K-12 education, et cetera, do you think are relevant to adjudicating these issues?
Sure. I do want to just touch upon school choice, because I think, seeing it here in Texas, I think it's still something that's driving a lot of that narrative, especially because it's kind of so much in the public conversation right now here. But I think it's, cost of living affordability and kind of tying into that housing, which all just, undergirds cost of living. I think that's a big part of it. And I think what I've also seen lately, it's kind of a broader conversation about labor, especially with younger voters. I've had a couple conversations. A guy named Chris Smalls who has pushed to unionize Amazon. He happens to be my nephew, and we talk a lot. We're on completely opposite sides of the spectrum on almost everything, but we talk a lot. And the way that he has been engaging and recruiting and exciting these younger voters on labor issues has been really interesting, and he's been going around to different cities and doing it. But really, I think the driver that I've personally been seeing has been cost of living, from what local governments are doing in terms of housing and land use and taxing and spending, and then looking at the economic side of that. So that's what we've been seeing.
Jason, I'd love to hear from you about the ways the trend we're discussing today should make the traditional conservative movement uncomfortable. Because there's this kind of contradiction, because growing up in the 2000s, I always remember conservatives traditionally discussing how class analysis, it's a very European thing, that's a left trend, America's a country where everyone basically says they're middle class, and that was seen as a very traditional American approach to these topics. But it seems to me that a class-based analysis of American politics and political economy isn't necessarily going to always trend in a direction that makes the conservative movement, which separate that from the Republican Party, comfortable. So I'd like to just hear how you think a more class focus in American politics, as opposed to racial depolarization, could potentially offer up roadblocks for the conservative movement.
I don't know that I would necessarily agree with the premise. One thing I think the Republican Party has learned from the Democratic Party, maybe the hard way, but they seem to start to learn it, is that overt racial appeals aren't necessarily the way to go. I do think you need to show up, and that is what Democrats have typically done. When it comes to their candidates running for office, they show up in the barbershops and the community centers and the churches and actually ask for the vote. And for a long time, Republicans have not done that. Or the ones that have done it have been the exceptions rather than the rule. But they're not advertising on black radio or black Twitter or black TV shows or so forth. They're sort of conceding this vote and throwing up issues like, well, we're for school choice. You should like that. There's also a way you need to talk about these issues. I remember when Ron DeSantis was still in the race, and he would make these statements about how evil public sector workers are, and I'm going to slash that on day one in there. And I said, I'm thinking, he must not be aware of how many black people work in the public sector or have government jobs or know someone who does. For everything from post offices to school teachers that's one of the challenges with using the school choice issue as a wedge issue. Bad schools stay open because they're still providing good middle class jobs. The education may be horrible, but there are a lot of people defending them because they're defending, and a lot of those jobs are minorities. And so when you have to know how to talk about these issues in ways that are not going to ostracise blacks as you're trying to appeal to them, and that's something I think Republicans are going to have to work on going forward. But I think the ultimate lesson of the Trump years, and it's not unique to Trump, we've seen it to some extent, whenever the economy is growing, whenever labor markets are tight, you seem to see a reduction in income inequality in this country. And so the focus on growing the economy and then trusting that black Americans will take advantage of this growing economy is what both parties, I think, need to do rather than making these overt racial appeals. But I said earlier that I think this trend we're seeing among working class blacks is a good one. And I mean that not because I want to live in a world where the Republican is winning 90% of the black vote either, because I think that will lead to the flip side of taking the black vote for granted. What I'd like to see is both parties competing for the black vote so that blacks can take advantage of our two-party system and use that to their benefit by playing one against the other to get better political representation. And if the black working class men are going to lead the way on that, I'm all for it.
Roy, I'll make my question to Jason a little more precise to get your perspective from it. Parties are coalitions, and we can understand that during the Trump years, in many ways, the Republicans have traded certain segments of the college and graduate school educated suburban middle class or upper middle class to the Democratic Party, and in certain ways that's presented an opportunity to pick up parts of this working class, non-college educated, male, broader racial category. When you bring in a new coalition, though, that actually changes the policies, the expectations, et cetera. And I think Jason's point about how, hey, in a world where you're taking on more persons of color who are working class, maybe the traditional medicine when it comes to public sector employees being bad, maybe has to be thrown out because that's just not going to actually work within your coalition. So I'd be curious from your perspective, in what ways would this trend continuing, especially in the class focus of that question I was asked earlier, change the Republican coalition's expectations, what it could actually ask of voters? How do you think about that?
No, I think that's a very reasonable question. I do think there's a tension there. I mean, just if we conceptualize the Republicans as increasingly becoming a working class party, less a party of, it's the country club Republicans doesn't begin to cut it anymore as a description of the party. The question is, what do you do with this new constituency? How do you keep them voting Republican, and how do you expand your base among those voters? We've got to deliver for those voters. How do you deliver for those voters? There may be contradictions between sort of standard issue Republican approach to economic issues and what these voters really want. A lot of them are quite populist. That's why Trump appeals to them. They are not necessarily on board with what the standard sort of conservative toolkit on economic issues was until basically Trump came along and blew some of it up. So does the Republican Party, in a sense, know what it wants to be at this point with this new constituent? They're like the dog that caught the bus. I mean, we got these working class voters. What do we do with them? And there is a debate, instantiated to some extent in those dueling manifestos of freedom conservatives and national conservatives. And my sense is, as an outside observer, that debate has not been resolved. And I think it'll continue to roil the party a bit going forward as again, they try to deal with this new coalition that has come into being.
Charles, something I'm curious about, in these conversations around realignments around class, race, et cetera, there's just increasing focus on the gender dynamic. I'd like you to speak from your experience about the real differences in, to borrow a term from the left, like the lived experiences of Black men and Black women, even within this working class category, if it's causing this clear dispersion, like in this context. I'm just curious if you have anything that is relevant there.
I think so. I mean, when you look at the issues that the left is starting to prioritize, I mean, they traditionally, Black voters have been their base, and they have traditionally focused on issues that would appeal to them, and now we're not seeing that anymore. And so, I mean, when we're looking at things, and we're talking about economic opportunities, and they're focused on providing opportunities, particularly here in Texas, where we have an immigration issue, and they're focused on that issue rather than focused on the immediate issues that are needed by people in our cities. I'm going to mention the school choice thing again, because, in the city of Houston, we've largest school district in the state, 7th largest in the country, and it's taken over by the state because it consistently failed for 10 years. And so when you're looking at the Democratic Party, which is now attacking the state for taking over the district, whereas we had a fully elected Black board that did nothing to improve the district for 10 years, I think people are frustrated with the party for attacking the state for that, when parents are now finally getting some resolution to an issue that they've been dealing with for more than a decade. Obviously, the gender issues that the party, the left, is now prioritizing, I think that's another one that is, they're so unwilling to have a conversation that if you disagree with them, you're automatically ostracized. And I think that's something that, particularly for Black men, is probably making them look the other way. And so I think it's this kind of reprioritization and leaning on their coalition partners for issues that they now want to prioritize, rather than prioritizing what the base has needed and prioritizing what they have focused on for years. And I think that has been, at least at the local level and some at the state level, has been kind of expediting this, I don't want to say departure, but I guess second look at a different party.
I think the Democratic playbook for turning out the Black vote is becoming less effective. And I think that's a good thing, because I think that's the identity politics, the race card, the focus on keeping Blacks angry and paranoid, saying their franchise is threatened every election cycle, when in fact Black turnout rates in some recent elections have actually exceeded white turnout rates, even in states with the strictest voter ID laws on the books. It's not working. And I think that's a good thing. You talk about within the, thinking back to COVID, and a lot of us were able to work from home, sort of just carried on that way. But there are a lot of people who could not do that. A disproportionate number of them were racial and ethnic minorities, working class folks. A lot of those jobs, delivery jobs, UPS, FedEx, and so forth, I'm still getting packages delivered to my house all the time. A lot of the people doing that were Black and brown. They wanted that economy reopened. Trump said a lot of things about trying to reopen the economy more quickly. Democrats wanted to be more cautious. And I think issues like that have resonated with Blacks in ways that they weren't before. And the Democrats haven't been able to hold on to those men by simply saying, you can't even consider the Republican Party, they're all racist. And these folks, through their lived experience, whatever, going, wait a minute, these guys were trying to get me back to work faster. You were trying to keep me home, or you were trying to keep my kids out of school or something. My kids don't go to school, I can't go to work. It's that sort of thing. And so these non-racial issues, I think, are becoming more prominent. Or I should say, the Democrats have not been so easily able to continue racializing every issue. It's not working like it used to work, and I think that's progress.
So Roy, we'll go to you. Then just note, I'm going to do a quick wrap question for everyone, and we'll get to questions. But Roy, please.
Okay, yeah, no, I just think one really interesting aspect of some of these racially polarized appeals that Democrats continue to try to make is, who are they really for? I mean, are they really for, say, Black voters? When Biden went down to Georgia, Jim Crow 2.0, it's just like Bull Connor. Who's that really for? Is that really for Black voters, or is that for the white, moderate to liberal, educated part of their base, which reads this stuff, says, "Oh my God, this is so terrible." And these people are, it's Weimar Republic 1932, the fascists are at the gates. I think, to be honest, I think that's who it's for. It's to really ramp up support among that part of the population, which is an increasingly important part of the Democrats' base. It's not really for, nor is it particularly effective with, the voters who allegedly were being suppressed by, for example, the Georgia voting law. And I think there was a famous poll that was done after the 2022 election, like among black voters, how many, did you have any trouble voting? 0%. So, I mean, they're talking about things in a way and at a level of rhetoric, turning it up to 11, that I really think is not really designed. Mayor Johnson made this point. It's not really designed for the non-white, the black and brown voters. In a lot of ways, it's designed to appeal to a certain, sector of the educated population who are liberalish and are have a certain view of America today. And essentially, the Democrats walk into that, and they may not even be aware they're doing it, but I think that's really what it's for. It's for, to be blunt, white college-educated liberals. And I think that it works with them. But I just think for normie, non-white voters, it doesn't work as well, and I think they think they can do both with this kind of rhetoric, and I think they're wrong about this, and I think that's part of what's going on.
So last wrap-up questions in this last 4 minutes or so, a minute and a half roughly each. Jason, you started this conversation by really pointing out that we should understand the 2015 period and the second term of the Obama presidency as being a culmination of a black political project that emerged out of the civil rights era, elect black officials all up and down the ballot, culminating in the presidency. You pointed out that in many ways during the Trump era, clearly working class blacks were dissatisfied with the results of that project. But I think also something that drove BLM and 2020 and the upheaval was actually, even within the black elite within higher education institutions and the media, there was distaste with that project. Now that we're kind of in this de-reckoning period, is that kind of how I define 2024, how would you say the black political elite within center-left institutions, what is the actual project at this point?
I think Rui just described what the actual project is. I mean, and there's always been this disconnect, and this is a point I've stressed time and again, between the black elites and the black rank and file, as there is between the white elites and the white rank and file. You watch your cable news shows after the Supreme Court makes the affirmative action decision, and the black elites are pulling their hair out. And I think the black working class is sort of shrugging. It's a very kind of muted response to ending racial preferences in higher education among the black rank and file. It's the elites who are upset about this sort of thing. And there's this disconnect there. You mentioned the voter ID laws. Majorities of blacks, whites, Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives all support voter ID laws. Voter ID laws have deep and wide support in this country. You would never know that watching MSNBC or CNN talk about voter suppression in this country. But that is the reality. This is something the elites obsess over. It's how the activists raise money by pretending it's still 1960 in this country with respect to voting or anything else. But I don't think it's really resonating as much or as it used to with the black rank and file.
Charles, 60 seconds. What does this story mean for Texas?
I think it provides an opportunity for Texas Republicans to, like Jason said, give black voters the opportunity for competition. I mean, I think that is what is necessary. I don't think when you look at black voters, they're necessarily running to Republicans as much as they're running kind of from the modern day Democratic Party. And I think the Republicans need to place themselves in a position and start talking about issues that affect them directly, that will put them in a place to be able to welcome them. And similarly to the black elite conversation, when we look at black mega churches and the issues that they're talking about, they're very different than the issues that black traditional churches are talking about. I mean, I've seen them talking about the voter ID laws, the gender issues, talking about how we had the Republican debate in Houston, the black mega churches were saying that Republicans hate black people and therefore you shouldn't embrace it at all. And so there's this kind of divergence there between the black elites and just traditional black voters, and I think Republicans need to be primed to take advantage of that, but it's the issues they focus on, it's the rhetoric, the way that they talk about the issues that needs to change.
And last question, Roy, now that The Atlantic is writing about this, now that the New York Times has written about this, this is now an officially sanctioned phenomenon
it's officially
that we discussed. as someone who actually, you worked at the Center for American Progress, like what has been the center-left, like intellectual response to this phenomenon now that it's acknowledged to be real and worthy of discussion?
Well, of course, yeah, the initial response was to deny that it's happening. But I think there's a certain sort of waking up and smelling the coffee aspect to what's going on today. There's sort of a rearguard action. We need to unscrew the polls here. They're not really accurate. But I think there is a sense that the Democrats' hegemonic hold on the black voter is slipping, and we should probably do something about it. But what? This is the problem. They don't really have a lot of other things in their toolbox besides the standard sort of racially polarized rhetoric and issues. And I think they're a little bit of a loss with how to deal with it. And I think part of the reason for that is that they're not really taking account of why blacks have been so uniform in their support for Democrats. To get back to the Steadfast Democrats book that Jason was mentioning, a lot of it is about the permission structure within the black community for voting other than Democratic. It's not there. The permission, basically you were sanctioned informally or formally, and it's uncomfortable to vote for the Republican, even think about it. That's breaking down. What do you do about the fact that it's breaking down? Because that's clearly the key. You don't get 90% of the black vote, without that kind of, that sort of hegemonic hold and the sort of the feeling you actually will suffer emotionally or in some other way if you don't vote Democratic. And that starts to break down. That permission structure starts to, sort of be available for voting for Republicans. How do you shore that up? And I think the center left literally has no idea what to do about that. And I think one reason they don't have any idea what to do about it is because they're not really, now that they've acknowledged there's some changes going on, they're not really understanding why it might be occurring, why what they said before, the approaches they had before, have stopped working as well. So I think they're a bit at a loss. I think they realize what they really need is to restore that that hold they had on black voters that's described in the Steadfast Democrats book, where it's just like beyond the pale for any black to think about voting for the Republicans. But how do you do that? They don't know. And I think that, in fact, if they were wise, they would realize that they're not going to restore that system again. They're going to have to deal with a more porous system, a permission structure for people to vote Republican that is going to have some legs. And if you're that party, you're the Democrats, you want to sort of minimize your losses. But you are going to lose some voters. But you can't do that until you recognize the realities of what you had to deal with, and I don't think they're there yet.
We will transition now to questions. We're kind of tight on time. You, sir. There's a microphone.
Jason really struck me with his discussion of how there's still a lot of black voters who work for the government in cities and post offices, social workers, and the like. And they disproportionately are black women. So do you think that may be a reason for this divergence between black women and black men, is that black women are so much more disproportionately in the social services, in the government, at a variety of ways, which black men aren't. I mean, there are some black men teachers, but they're not as dominantly government workers.
Well, yes, I think that could explain it somewhat, but it is broadly true across both genders. Postal workers, school teachers. I mean, my father worked for a state hospital. I had an uncle, by the time he died, he was drawing a pension from having been in the military, and then after leaving the military, having worked for the IRS for 20 years. I mean, it's just, so when conservatives go and talk about small government, which I support, small government and low taxes and so forth, that is a signal to some blacks, like, you're going to be eliminating the kinds of jobs I have and everybody I know has. And I'd be crazy to vote for you if you're promising to do this. and so, yeah, you've got to learn how to discuss these issues in a way that is not going to result in that sort of backlash.
Raihan?
I'm particularly wanting to direct this to Rui. There's a line of argument among progressives that organized labor is a very effective way to take what you might call socially liberal norms and transmit them to the working class. And my sense is that this has actually been a pretty successful project. If you look at Clark County, Nevada, for example, if you look at changing public opinion on LGBT issues among members of unions. However, at the same time, in the private sector, unions are not really a meaningful presence. So, I say this as someone who's not a big fan of organized labor. What do you think about that strategy of card check and what have you, and trying to use unionization as the way to basically remake the sensibilities of the working class in a more, call it, elite progressive direction?
Yeah, I think that if you could jack up the unionization rate in the country by 10 points, I think that all else equal would help the Democrats quite a bit. Though I think it's important to keep in mind, of course, the difference between public sector and private sector. That's really where the union density is today, is in the public sector. I think that public sector workers in general tend to be more liberal. If you look at private sector unions at this point, in a lot of unions, you can see this huge divergence between the views of the leadership and the views of the rank and file. Like, I talked to the operating engineers the other day, and they let me have some of their data from their membership. So the leadership, 100% pro-democratic, totally there. It's like 65% of these people voted for Trump in 2020. So, there's a real divergence there. So it doesn't necessarily follow that if you unionize workers in a given area, that automatically you turn everybody into a loyal Democrat. You may have an extremely loyal union leadership, and that's helpful for the Democrats, and maybe at the margin you move a few voters, sort of by virtue of the union apparatus toward the Democrats. But the hold of those union leaders on their rank and file just isn't, I think, what it used to be in the past. So I think you could question the leverage of this strategy, even assuming that you could actually make it happen, like have a lot more union members. So I wouldn't put my eggs in that basket.
Robert?
Possible that one of the big issues in the coming campaign, I think, is going to be immigration policy and attitude toward immigrants. And I wondered what the panel thinks about how black voters will react to how Republicans talk about immigration policy and how they talk about immigrants, or President Trump talks about immigrant policy and immigrants. And is there what's going on there in the black community?
Well, anecdotally, I can tell you my grandmother, who was 20-year chair of the County Democratic Party of where she lives just outside of New York, probably speaks worse than the Republican Party does right now because of what she's seeing in her area. And similarly, a family in South Carolina who are dealing with this issue with, Texas and other states sending immigrants up there and them getting government benefits and stuff. I wouldn't say they speak as bad as the Republican Party does, but they're pretty frustrated as well. And so I think the issue and them dealing with it far outweighs, in my opinion, the rhetoric that they're hearing on that specific issue. And I could be, the panel might disagree, but.
No, I think tensions have worsened under Obama between the black communities and the migrant populations, particularly in these cities where Abbott's been sending. But even the Chicagos, the New Yorks, and the black mayors of these cities know this. And part of the problem is the Democratic Party has done a very good job of conditioning their black voters to believe that government handouts are the solution to these problems. Black voters look at this and they say, well, if some of these handouts are going to this new group, they're not going to our community, and maybe that's the problem here. And so there's a fight over welfare benefits. And it's causing all kinds of tensions that I think weren't there, or certainly weren't there to the same degree prior to this migrant crisis. And it's very interesting that it's happening in blue states and in blue cities and blue states that I think has inadvertently caused all kinds of problems for Democratic elected officials.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no question if you look at the underlying data that there's, your sort of median black voter is now pretty tough on immigration. They're not really happy with the way that Biden administration has handled the immigration issue. They're very unhappy about illegal immigrants spilling into the cities, taxing resources. It does inevitably raise the question, why are you providing all these things for these people who shouldn't even be here? And in my community, in my neighborhood, we're really not doing very well and we need more resources, whatever it is they think they need. So that's just a glaring contradiction in these, as you say, these blue cities, many of which are sort of so-called sanctuary cities. I mean, this is a really bad look. I mean, this is part of the Democratic approach to, one of these socioculturally freighted issues that you really are, have a section of the Democratic Party that's all in on a certain approach to the immigration issue that's completely, I think, contradictory to where a lot of black voters are coming from. It's totally out of their wheelhouse. And now that's sort of being brought home to them in a very material way by some of these developments in these cities. So I think it's going to continue to be a thorn in their side and could be one of the things that sort of leads to less black support for the Democrats.
There's one other aspect of this, though, is the criminal justice system element. You have, in these communities, and it doesn't get a lot of media attention, but you go into these cities and there are people who saying, why is Jamal locked up and Jose is breaking laws and he gets let go, he's committing crimes, he's entered the country illegally. Why are our kids getting locked up and the law enforcement coming down so hard on them, but giving these migrant lawbreakers a pass? And that issue also resonates with some people in these black communities in my reporting.
Sir, in the middle.
Thank you. I'm sensing here that we're witnessing a great awakening in the destabilization of power dynamics in politics. And my question is, do you think that we are nearing the end or at the end of the color line?
No.
No.
The racial grievance industry is alive and well. It's very lucrative. I don't see it, as Rui was saying, with Joe Biden going down and talking about Georgia, Jim Crow 2.0, it still works in different ways. If we were near the end of this era you're talking about, you wouldn't see the rise of groups like Black Lives Matter. The progressive left, why is Ibram Kendi doing so well? Why is Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ta-Nehisi Coates? To me, that is a sign that there's still money to be made, celebrity fame out there for people who want to go that route and sort of participate in the sort of racial hustle industry in this country. So no, I don't think we're anywhere near that, and they don't want to be anywhere towards. I mean, no, you don't. If you're really interested in a post-racial society, you don't name your organization Black Lives Matter. You don't push for racial preferences. You don't. So no, I don't think.
I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and disagree with you for a quick second.
Yeah.
I think the reason, when I hinted at this in a question, the reason why you see the rise of Black Lives Matter and these certain groups, I think, is actually because the center-left traditional approach doesn't work anymore. You said this in your opening answer. Like, there was an answer. It was elect more black voters. I elect more black officials. And because that no longer works as a means of advancing both like the center-left elites, like happiness, but also like the working class, that's expanded the Overton window to welcome in more radical approaches. But those radical approaches wouldn't be welcomed in the first place if the status quo before 2015 still worked. So I think that's just like a quick addendum I'd add.
Yeah. Oh, you want me to talk?
No, not about me, but just we'll take one more question.
No, I really agree with Jason. I mean, you look at the way our culture still works, the way our political discussion still, evolves, and it's clear we're pretty far away from that. One way I think about it is, a certain point of view about race and a lot of other issues that controls the commanding heights of cultural production in this country, and it's very hard to get out of that. And there's a lot of institutional presence for people who are very invested in continuing that kind of polarization around race or that kind of dialogue around race. So the fact that we're not in the George Floyd summer anymore, that things are somewhat better than they were several years ago. We've still got a long ways to go before I think we can have an honest, an open dialogue about these issues.
If you could ask your question in 10 seconds, we'll be good to go.
Jason, do you think the black elite are the equivalent of the 21st century slavers? And why is it that all of the black left organizations and the black right organizations exist with the support of white money, and there's no evidence of black elites or black folks funding anything politically outside of a few PACs and independent donations? Why is it that there's not the participation financially?
Well, I don't know that that's true, and I think white philanthropists have long supported black causes on the left or right. You can go back to, Spelman was started by Rockefeller money. Booker T. Washington was supported by white philanthropists.
I meant black money. If you look at NAACP, Urban League, if you look at CBC, if you look at the handful of black conservative organizations, all the sponsors are going to be white. There's no evidence of black elites.
Well, I don't know. You have people like Bob Johnson out there spending money on black organizations. You have Oprah. You have some wealthy black people in this country. Some of them are philanthropists, and some of them do support liberal causes. I'm not sure it's as stark a contrast as you're describing. In terms of the slavery analogy, no, I kind of steer clear of that. I don't think it's very helpful in terms of engaging on the issue, and also even arguing that the other side is necessarily operating in bad faith. There are people who honestly believe that there is a government solution to many of the problems facing blacks, and they're out there fighting for that. I happen to disagree with them, but I don't think it makes them a bad person necessarily or worthy of being compared to a slaveholder. I wouldn't go there with the rhetoric.
So I'm going to call time. This has been an excellent panel. Let's say a quick thank you to our panelists.